I'd like to introduce Marianne. Everybody knows her. I think of you as our smart controller, Marianne, because you're so much on the ball. And I know you were going to try and do 2 things at once, if not 3 tonight, but hopefully we can relieve you a little bit of that. So there's so much to learn about Albert Schweitzer, so I'll get on to that first slide. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you. So that is oh, can you share your screen?
Yeah, should be coming up, I think.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yep, that's coming. Perfect. Thank you. Well, this is a statue of Schweitzer, which stands above his childhood village in Alsace, and I hope to be able to see it in the summer. Okay, next slide. Can you?
Yeah. How did we do it before? It was the arrow, wasn't it?
The arrows, yes.
No. Oh, there we are.
There we are. Okay. So why Schweitzer? Well, as most of you know, I am neither a philosopher nor a theologian, but I've always been an admirer of Schweitzer. And even when I was a kid, those are books that I bought when I was a child, and I have never, ever, ever got rid of them. And there's been quite a few still since have joined them in my bookshelves. And it's in the beginning, what I really knew about was his involvement in tropical medicine. I didn't know much else, but there is a lot more, and we'll talk about a little bit. Now, this is an In Conversation series, and some of you, well, probably quite a few of you, are much more knowledgeable about philosophy and theology, and I hope that as we get into the discussion afterwards, you know, quite a few of you may be able to answer some of the questions that might come up that maybe I am not knowledgeable about enough. So next slide, please, Anne.
Whoops.
That's it. The one before, I think. Yes. Schweitzer was born in Kaisersberg, which is a little village in the High Rhine, which is Department 68, the Haut-Rhin. And he was born in Kaisersberg, which was a mainly Catholic little town. At the time that he was born, even though it was in Alsace, it was German, not French. And because France had been defeated by the German Empire in 1871, so 4 years before Schweitzer's birth. So he was, although his parents had been French, he was born German. They spoke Alsatians, and his parents spoke French as well, and he spoke German at school. So he was fully bilingual, English, not English, French and German, and then also spoke the local dialect of German. Next slide, please, Anne. Although he was born in Kaisersberg, they moved to Günzbach, a village really about 20 kilometers away, mainly Protestant, when Schweitzer was 6 months old. His father had been appointed as a Lutheran pastor of the local parish. And interestingly, there's quite a few village or parishes called simultaneous in Alsace. They are parishes where the churches are shared between the Catholics and the Protestant. But Louis XIV actually edicted that if there were 7 Catholic families in a mainly Protestant village, hold on, let me try. See if I can mute whoever. And so if there was at least 7 Catholic families in these villages, the churches were to be shared with the choir reserved for the Catholics, and the nave used by both. Okay, so Schweitzer always said that taught him tolerance between the Catholics and the Protestants. He started studying piano when he was 5, and when his legs were long enough, he started learning the organ in his parish church. And at the age of 9, he was already replacing the organist if he was unwell. Next slide, please, Anne. He didn't strike anybody as exceptional when he was at school, but when he turned 18, he joined the University of Strasbourg and studied both theology and philosophy. Now, after the 1871 victory of the German Empire, the Germans were keen to make sure that Alsace-Lorraine and part of the Moselle were Germanified. So they sent some quite high quality lecturers at the University of Strasbourg. And because of that, Schweitzer was a student of one such lecturer, Heinrich Holzmann, who was an expert in historic critical reading, rejecting literal reading of the Bible. And Schweitzer was so inclined as well. So they became friends, became good friends. By the age of 25, which I didn't do, I don't know how many of you did, but he already had 3 degrees and a PhD in philosophy, which was with the topic of Immanuel Kant. He was already ordained as a Lutheran minister. He had studied the organ with Eugène Munch in Mulhouse and Strasbourg. And then he studied with Charles-Marie Widor, who is an organist and a composer in Paris. Now, Widor did not speak German, but Schweitzer spoke both German and French. And so he taught Widor about the poetry in the music of Bach. And of course, Widor taught him about the music of Bach. So he became an expert on Bach and organ building as well, and organ restoring. And he published books on Bach, and he published books on organ building and restoring. And he recorded some organ music as well. And at that time too, he was a university lecturer and a dean of the Theological College. Now, those 2 posts he gave up when he started medicine. So by 31, he had then completed his 2nd PhD in theology, and the topic of that PhD was the quest of the historical Jesus. And he started medicine at the age of 30, kept his job as a curate and a concert organist during that period as well. Okay, next slide, please, Anne. The quest for the historical Jesus, that's where I have got to ask some of you, if questions come up on this topic, for enlightenment, if I fail to know enough about the topic. But basically, my understanding is it was comparing the historical Jesus, the one who walked the streets, and the Christ of faith, the more supernatural figure at the heart of Christianity today. So if somebody is interested in actually proposing such a session for this series, they would be more than welcome. Next, please, Anne. Now, in his early days, is there a sound that's... in the early days, he was always struck by the fact that he had actually been extremely privileged, and he couldn't see that it was conceivable that he should be allowed to be so happy while he saw so many people around him struggling with sorrow and suffering. And in fact, when he was at school, when he was about 8 or 9, can I ask everybody to mute themselves? And when he was at school, because he was the son of the pastor, he was slightly more privileged, both in terms of education and in terms of wealth, really. And so he had nice clothes, warm clothes for the winter, and he then simply refused to wear the hats that his mother gave him, the coat, and the shoes. He would only wear the same clothes as his local friends at school were wearing. So they had clogs, and they had the same clothes for winter and summer, and they had a sort of beret type thing rather than a warm hat. His parents tried to dissuade him to do that, but he point blank refused, and so they let him. And when he was studying, began his studies as well, he came across this, well, I mean, he must have known it quite well before, but this verse from Matthew really struck him. Anyone who wants to save his life will lose it, but anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it. And he reflected on this for quite a while. And at the age of 21, he finally decided that what it meant for him would be that he would be justified in living for science and art until the age of 20 or 30. But then he would consecrate the rest of his life to serve humanity. And at that point, he said that that gave him inner happiness. He had offered help to help things like prisoners and orphans or the homeless. But every time he submitted an application, that was turned down. Next, please, Anne. And in 1905, just before, so when he was 29, he came across an article in this journal, the Journal of the Evangelical Missions of Paris. And in that article, there was an article from a missionary in the Congo, and it was probably Congo-Brazzaville rather than the Belgian Congo. And this chap actually said that there was a great need for medical practitioners in that area because healthcare was practically non-existent. And so he applied to the evangelical mission to be accepted as a doctor in Lambaréné, because Lambaréné was a place that the evangelical missions had territory, and so he would have been able to work there. But they weren't very happy about the quest of the evangelical Jesus, and they turned him down initially. So he could have gone to a second interview, but he refused. Instead, he went around each of the panel members and convinced them that he was their man. And they accepted his proposal on the condition that not only would he not preach, but also he would have to self-finance. He could use the grounds, but he would have to self-finance. Next, please, Anne. When he told his friends and relatives that he was going to study medicine, some of them were shocked. Why medicine when he was already a well-known academic and a very respected organist? And he said, I wanted to be a doctor, that I might be able to work without having to talk. For this new form of activity, I could not represent myself as talking about the religion of love, but only in actually putting it to practice. At that time, he had already had contact with Hélène Breslau. She was the daughter of a historian at the University of Strasbourg, and he was brought in from Berlin in the Germanification of Alsace. They had been corresponding for about 10 years, and she supported him fully. And she then also, while he was doing medicine, she did nursing to support him when he went to Africa. And they got married in 1912. Next, please, Anne. He then, in 1913, he went to the Gabon, which was part of the French Equatorial Africa, which was made of the Gabon now, the French Congo, so Congo-Brazzaville now, Chad, which is still Chad, and the Central African Republic as it is now. And Lambaréné is well inland from Port-Gentil, and that is where he went. And the trip took about 3.5 weeks from Bordeaux to the Gabon, as it is now. Next, please. Now, he qualified as a doctor in 1911, 1912, because he had to do an extra year clinical practice and tropical medicine. And when he arrived in Lambaréné, he found a situation which was actually quite worse than what he had expected. He expected diseases such as malaria, leprosy, sleeping sickness, etc. But he was surprised by the very high rate of heart disease and pneumonia, and particularly hernia. He operated on hernias much more than he would have expected in Europe. Now, the heart disease, at that time, there was no antibiotics. And I imagine that there must have been quite a few cases of rheumatic fever, which led to heart disease. And I think the differences in sanitation and the climate probably had some effect on that. He also met different attitudes. For example, he was told never to give hope to a patient if the case was pretty hopeless, and never admit dying patients, because witch doctors don't admit dying patients, because if they die, it's only bad doctors who lose their patients. So it was better to be blunt and not really to take care of dying patients if you could help it. I don't think that's what Schweitzer did, but that is what he was told. And he was still, he was also quite surprised by the amount of witchcraft and spells that was being encouraged. And actually my sister lives in Senegal, and she tells me now it's still, even among very educated people, it's still something that is talked about on a very regular basis. Thanks, Anne. Next one. So they arrived in Lambaréné in 1913, but in 1914, about 15 months later, World War I started. And as Schweitzer and his wife were German, they were put under house arrest in Lambaréné, and Schweitzer was forbidden from practicing medicine. But after some complaints by the locals, that was lifted. But they were prisoner of war. And in 1917, they were ordered back to France, and then they were interned in a tiny place in the south of France, near the foot of the Pyrenees, near Lourdes. And there they were both quite ill. I think 4 years in the tropics, and then ending up in a really damp and quite cold place. Didn't do anything for their health. His wife developed tuberculosis at that time, and that actually really plagued her for the rest of her life. Then they were transferred to Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, which probably had a better climate. And at the end of the war, 1918, a treaty was signed that meant that Alsace, Lorraine, and Moselle returned to France, although the treaty wasn't signed until 1920. And they returned to Lambaréné eventually in 1924, because during the time they were in France, first of all, they had to recover from the experience in the Pyrenees, and then he had to give concerts and conferences to raise money to go back to Lambaréné. Next, please, Anne. So Schweitzer had a PhD both in theology and in philosophy, and he had come to the conclusion that the 19th century philosophy and 19th century philosophy and science were really centered on the process of science and tiny details in terms of scientific approaches, but not on the process of understanding human intentions. And that to him was quite a limitation. Next, please. Yeah. And in 1915, so before he returned to France, he came across, this came to him really. He was traveling up the Ogooué River to visit a sick Swiss missionary, and by the way, Schweitzer means Swiss. And he says, we were moving along the island, set in the middle of a wide river, and on a sandbank on our left, 4 hippopotamuses and their young plodded along in our direction. Just then, in my great tiredness and discouragement, there flashed upon my mind, unforeseen and unsought, the phrase, reverence for life. Now I had found my way to the idea in which affirmation of the world and ethics are contained side by side. Only by means of reverence for life can we establish a spiritual and humane relationship with both people and all living creatures within our reach. So not just human beings, but the whole of the ecological system. Next, please. Now, ethics is generally defined as a good behavior towards ourselves and others because of an obligation not to worry only about ourselves, but only about others and the world. But in effect, there is a progression of thought in ethics. For example, in the most primitive of society, well, sometimes we're quite primitive as well, individuals will actually look at their family and tribes. And Schweitzer said many times when he asks somebody to do something for somebody else, this person would say, well, he's not my brother, doesn't come from my tribe. And it didn't matter how he was cajoled or coerced to do something, he just wouldn't do it if the person for whom he should do it was not from his tribe. And then he describes ethics developing as to encompass the wider society. But even in the wider society, there are still exclusion criteria, for example, in the system of caste, like in India, or system of creeds or nationality or race. We do discriminate, and that was not actually what Schweitzer thought was going to be the content of reverence for life. So eventually we end up with humanity, ethics of humanity, where all human beings are considered equal in rights and their contribution to knowledge. And then the next step would be to include animals in the reverence for life principle, and then the whole world. Next, please. Right. The definition of good and evil in this context of the development of ethics in the development of human thought, Schweitzer define what good and evil are, and what is fundamentally good is when it aims at preserving life, at fostering it, at developing it to its highest level, and evil is what aims at destroying life, cheating it, and or hindering its development. The principle of his reverence for life is similar, but superior, in that love as revealed by religion and philosophy, when superior to that of love as revealed by religion and philosophy, when they try to understand the fundamental concept of good. Okay, next, please, Anne. This was taken from a conference that Schweitzer did at the Paris Academy of Political, not political, moral and moral philosophy, that's the sort of thing it's called. Reverence for life. And if you have the opportunity to see it, I mean, there are plenty of internet YouTube videos, including the 3rd series of the Sea of Faith, where Don Cupid talks specifically about Schweitzer in the second half of the program. But even though you want to look at good in terms of including, doing all that is good, the problem is that if you encompass in good not only human beings but animals and plants, etc., there is a dilemma in as much as the survival of some depends on the loss of others. I mean, I have never felt sad about a mosquito, but clearly he wouldn't have killed a mosquito if he didn't have to. And the way to conscience then responds each time, the way to our conscience can respond each time to try better to comprehend our position in the world is to look at it as saying, I am life that wishes to live amidst life that wishes to live. So there is a competition, a dilemma in that competition. And the answer to that dilemma is to adopt only the same principle that never destroy life unless unavoidable. So in Lambaréné, he would feed the people who came because they came from quite long distances. So although it wasn't a hospital, it was a village hospital, whereby his purpose was not to create a hospital, but rather to create an environment where he could look after people and provides medical care as much as possible. So one of the things they had to do was feed these people. But the problem was that the primeval forest has very little opportunity for agriculture and very little opportunity for keeping animals like cows or sheep or whatever. And so they could fish, but they could only fish at some time of the year because of the way the river was going up and down. So he had to provide the food, and some of it meant also provide food from abroad, and that was transported to Lambaréné. Next, please, Anne. So in Schweitzer's theory of reverence for life, principle of reverence for life, he states that this reverence for life makes no distinction between a more valuable life and a less valuable life, between a superior life and an inferior life. It rejects such distinctions because accepting these differences in value between living beings and things basically amounts to judging them according to the greater or less similarity of their sensitivity to ours. And this is entirely subjective, so this would be rejected. For who among us knows what significance the other living being has for itself and for the world? Next, please. Yeah. Now, so Schweitzer arrived in 1913, then was only there for about 4 years, then returned in 24. And in 1952, he was awarded, he'd already been through 2 world wars. And at the end of the Second World War, he had, we had the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the Nobel Peace Prize awarded him the Peace Prize for his altruism, reverence for life, and tireless humanitarian work which had helped make the idea of brotherhood between men and nations a living one. And he couldn't attend Oslo in 52 because he was in Africa, and he then went there in 54 and gave his speech on the problem of peace. And I don't think it can be summarized really, but I think it's worth reading, and it is on YouTube. He goes, YouTube. He goes through, on the internet rather, he goes through the whole history of humanity in terms of war and philosophy. And it is really, really interesting. And it shows also the foresight that he had for many, many years. From the very beginning, even in 1913, he was already talking about the madness of human beings willing to destroy each other. And after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, talking about that the more advanced technology became, the more savage, in a way, humanity was, and the more likely we are to destroy our planet. Next, please. Yes. Then having, so he says the technical development are a potential danger for the planet. Now, at that point, in the early 50s, he was, he had very good relationship with Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and Oppenheimer, even though Oppenheimer and Einstein had both been influential and influential in the development of the atomic bomb. Nonetheless, they had come to the point where going against the nuclear armament was the thing that they wanted to do. And so they communicated quite a lot, but Schweitzer never wanted to really express his views in public because he thought he wasn't at a place where that was useful. But there was also a politician, and I'm sure many of you will remember the name of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations, and who was actually murdered. Well, we think he was murdered in a plane crash over the Congo when there were rather nasty negotiation between, in the Belgian Congo, ex-Belgian Congo, about Lumumba and Katanga province and Chombe. And an American journalist who was very active in the anti-nuclear nuclear disarmament program went with Erika Anderson, who was a photographer who had done, who had been going backwards and forward to Lambaréné for about 10 years. She went with him, and he was able to convince Schweitzer to get involved. And that meant that, next please, that meant that at the age of 82, Schweitzer returned to Oslo in 57, and they organized a program on the radio and he read a declaration of conscience. And again, very, very interesting text, because Schweitzer goes through the whole details of the development of radiation until the nuclear weapons, and encourages people to fight against nuclear armaments. This was met by rather critical US government text, and that again is also available on the internet. If you're not really with them, you're against them, and they did not hold back really. It's worth reading as well. Next, please. So what can we learn from Schweitzer? Well, I believe that, and this is what Jimmy Carter says, that his example set a powerful and inspirational standard for many people who have attempted in various ways to follow in his footsteps. He also said that Schweitzer gives the example of an experience in a small village that can radiate throughout the world. Yes, please. Now, Schweitzer was often asked about what he was doing and why he was doing it, etc. And he often replied, "My life is my argument." And I think that summarizes really responses to any questions. And there was a French author of a play who says, "We must live the way we think, or else sooner or later we shall think the way we have lived." And I think that's quite challenging. In French, it sounds even nicer, but you know, English. Okay, thank you.